Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I'm pleased to welcome you all to EMU Department of Interior Architecture Webinar Series 1. Today, we have the honor of introducing Sally Stone to give our first series of webinar talks. For more than 30 years, Sally Stone has been discussing, formulating ideas, and writing about interiors, architecture, and building reuse. She recently published UnDoing Buildings, Adaptation and Cultural Memory, and she is also the co-author of a number of other books, including Rereading Volumes 1 and 2, From Organization to Decoration, and the series Interior Architecture and Approach. She co-created the exhibition UnDoing at the Radical Independent Castlefield Gallery in the centre of Manchester, which explored the disconnected yet similar approaches that artists and architects take to the already existing environment. Sally Stone directs the postgraduate atelier, Continuity in Architecture, and leads the Master of Architecture at the Manchester School of Architecture. She is currently working with Professor Eppolis from University of Edinburgh on a new book called Inside Information, the 26 Defining Concepts of the Interior. And before beginning to today's talk, I would like to give the word respectively to our Department of Interior Architecture Chair, Associate Professor Dr. Zehra Öngül, and Coordinator of EMU Department of Interior Architecture Webinar Series, Associate Professor Dr. Hacer Başarır.
I couldn't catch up, but I think the words are now me. Am I right?
Yes, hocam.
Dear colleagues and students, as a head of Department of Interior Architecture, on behalf of all of you, I would like to express my gratitude, dear Sally Stone, for sharing her experiences and insight with us. Also, I would like to extend my thanks to our dear Associated Professor Dr. Hacer Başarır, Dindic, to put her effort to realize this event. Besides all the stresses of the pandemic, also opened new doors for us in terms of collaboration. It taught us possibilities of global sharing. I am sure these collaborations will bring new perspectives which are much needed facts of the new normal. We will do our best to strengthen these connections by pulling them to institutional levels as well. I hope you enjoyed the talks as much as I did and hope to see you all in the upcoming ones as well. Thank you, dear Sally, much appreciated. We hope to realize different activities together and host you here in our beautiful island, Cyprus as well. Welcome.
Thank you, Zehra Hocam. Thank you, dear Sally. I am actually honored to be the organizer of this event today. Sally and I, we were actually first met in 2008, very long time ago in Manchester. She's actually a close friend of my PhD supervisor as well. And since then, I've been following her work, her books, especially books like Rereadings and all her projects on reuse. And once again, I just would like to thank her for her generous acceptance of my invitation. And hopefully, as our chair mentioned, we would like to, of course, continue this collaboration in the near future as well. I am sure it will be a great source of inspiration for our students and instructors. So thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you very much.
And now, please join me in welcoming Sally Stone with her today's lecture titled as UnDoing Buildings.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It was very nice, and it is a great pleasure to be here. And yes, it would be fabulous to be able to continue our collaborations sometime in the future, when this is all over, when this is all a memory. And I am in the process of setting up architecture and reuse program, master's level course. So as a collaborative tool, that could be fantastic. But let me share my lecture with you. And if you can't see that, you'd tell me, wouldn't you? Okay, thank you. So it's a great pleasure to be able to open the lecture series at the Interior Architecture Department at EMU. And in that lovely introduction, it did mention some of my books, but my research, because I've been publishing for a long time, has really defined interior architecture as a discipline, defined a methodology for the analysis, development, design and construction of interior architecture, and my methodology is extensively and internationally used as the basis for education of architects and interior designers. So these are some of my books, most recently the one on the right, UnDoing Buildings, which came out last year. Some other books, including the series Interior Architecture, which is now in 11 different languages, and I think this one is in Latvian. And in the introduction, it was discussed the exhibition I had very recently, which discussed the relationship between artists and architects and how they may have the same starting point for a project, but the way it finishes is radically different. The results are very different. I'm also very proud to say that I was responsible for helping to save a very, very important modernist building, something that was destined just to be demolished to make way for a surface car park and a site for potential future reuse. But I ran a series of projects, and these are with my students, here you can see, which brought the building to greater attention, especially locally. And hopefully the people, during this period, the building, according to the local newspaper, went from the most hated building to the most loved building. And I think what it was is a lot of local people didn't appreciate how good it was. They assumed everybody and every town had something as good as this. I run the atelier, postgraduate atelier, Continuity in Architecture at the Manchester School of Architecture. And here we look at the design of new buildings, but also adaptations, interiors and interventions within the environment of the already built. So I'd like to talk today a little bit about one of the lesser known aspects of interior architecture, and that's taking away. That idea of stripping back or subtracting things and the consequences of that. It's not as productive as adding to a building, but it's a very, very important element. And we start with in what was possibly an apocryphal tale that has now achieved legendary status. The artist Gordon Matter Clark was once invited to create an installation for the Ideas as Models exhibition at the Institute for American and Urban Studies. This is the glamorous architectural think tank in Lower Manhattan. He was one of an illustrious crowd, which included 3 members of the so-called New York Five, Richard Meyer, Charles Guthrie and Michael Graves. The Institute was founded by Peter Eisenman, so you can see it's a very important team of white male architects. And all of them were recognised as progressive and for the exploration and analysis of architects, and we can see those architects there. And the sort of buildings, really, this is a Richard Meyer building. And Matt Clark's proposal was to place a photograph of a vandalised building from the South Bronx in almost every available window. In the others, he'd already contained cracked glass, which he gave permission from the gallery owner to actually break the glass and therefore emulate the other images in the photographs. This piece was entitled Blowout and was a statement about the housing conditions of the city's poor. Oh, crikey, it's a bit pixelated, that. However, sometime during the night before the show, Matt Clark turned up at the gallery and he was, to quote, incredibly wrecked. And he was carrying an air pistol. He then proceeded to shoot out all of the windows of the floor of the Institute while raging hysterically about the self-important and pretentious concept of the abstract notion of modern architecture. It was a statement that reflected the character of the surrounding areas. This is a South Bronx area where people lived in barely habitable apartments, and the context that had informed the fury in the installation. But what has actually elevated this act of violence to legendary status is the reaction of the gallery elite. They did not embrace this radical and progressive action. Instead, the mess was cleared up and the glass replaced. The act of extreme violence was immediately countered with one of polite refusal. The process of recognition that led the artist to make a dramatic intervention within the interior space. The subtractions of elements from the interior somehow liberated the space. It was a statement that connected it with its immediate environment. And therefore, Matt Clark transgressed the boundaries of what was acceptable in 1976. His unconventional statement was the result of an analysis of the existing environment, an understanding of what was there, and then using this information to inform his actions. He read the situation and revealed the underlying condition. And this is much of how Matt Clark works. His study of the context leads him to interpret it. And within that context, the Bronx context, he smashed the building. But within other projects, the act of taking away is of paramount importance. So this is a project called Splitting, and where you can see that Matt Clark has just simply cut a building in half. Now these are buildings that were destined to be demolished, so but he's cut it in half. But I hope you can see my mouse. He actually removed a section from the foundations on the right-hand side, which allowed the building to drop slightly and therefore accentuate that split. And these are a photo montage that he's constructed where you can see into each of the rooms. And that idea of exposing what is there, we can see again, oh, another part of the same project, by creating connections that weren't once there between elements of a building. And his Matt Clark, who's actually the godson of Marcel Duchamp and the son of Matter, the artist, but he also trained as an architect, so he knows how to cut buildings up without completely compromising the structural integrity, but using that as the basis for making any changes. And again, bingo 5, removing bits of a building to expose the insides of them, and conical intersect. This is constructed quite near the Pompidou in Paris, and was a series of cones cut, cone-like voids cut through the building, which immediately created connections which weren't there. You know, when you're in a flat and there's someone in the flat next door, but the entrance is on the other side of the building, so you have no physical connection with the people who are immediately next to you. And here we are again, we can see it again. This isn't one of Matt Clark's, but I always quite like the idea of being able to cut a building, remove it from its foundations and float it into somewhere else. And then Duchamp. There's an English joke which may not translate, but when is a door not a door? It's when it's ajar. A door that's slightly open is referred to as being ajar. But here, Duchamp, in the corner of his studio, installed a door in the corner. So one door is always open and one door is always closed. So you can never be completely one situation or the other. And this is a fabulous project in Liverpool a couple of years ago. Well, a long time ago now, 13 years ago now. And again, it's about cutting things away and the impact that that has. So I'm hoping this. Oh, come on. Technology's not on our side today. This is a video of it. On it. Sorry about that, it's because I changed computers. So it's not happy. Come on. I have to admit, I don't know where we are now.
Now we are seeing the document, the presentation document, with the slides on the left. Now we are seeing it as full screen.
Right. Sorry about that. I told you we might be a bit unlucky with this very, very old computer that I moved the presentation onto. So we can't see this, but if any of you ever get the chance to have a look at this as an intervention within an existing building, there are many YouTube videos of it. And what Richard Wilson did was cut an oval shape from the front of the building. He then attached it to a rotating rod and turned it over. And the magical thing was that the axis of the rod was not on the axis of the building. So it appears to swing out of the building and then back into it to when it gets replaced. And it is a magical thing to see. And it would have been very nice to show you because of that sense of subtracting, of taking away, of removing bits from the building, which make the familiar unfamiliar and the unfamiliar familiar. Let's not try again. So it's the same process that the interior architect can engage with when remodeling buildings, and it's often result in equally destructive consequences, although not always so destructive or so political as Matta Clark, but quite often as beautiful as Richard Wilson. When working with the existing building, the designer will use the analysis and understanding of the qualities of that context to provide the impetus for change. This process of investigation and examination promotes a certain kind of sensibility, an acceptance of what is already on or around the site, and the willingness to accentuate these found elements or narratives. This method of comprehension encourages a responsiveness and a sensibility that is described by Rodolfo Mercado in his essay, Old Buildings as Palimpsest. In remodelling, the past takes on a value far different from that in the usual design process, where form is generated from scratch. Stripping back, subtraction, or even demolition can be considered as processes that are actually precursors to the real act of intervention. At some step, intellectual or intuitive, that the designer must pass through to reach the main or central point of the design process. The designer often sees this as unimportant, but an almost secondary stage. It has little more than a minor role in the creative method. But Fred Scott, in his book Adaptations, describes it as a means by which the designer can begin a negotiation between the ideal and the actual, and also begin the process of intervention by which disparate parts must be made to cohabit. The process of removing elements of an existing building can convey many different types of message and contain a variety of meanings. The architect and designer can use it to respond to particular contextual factors. Matt Clark's installations were a reaction to social conditions. Other architects have responded to particular situations in a similarly deleterious manner. And I'll show you a few examples. In Madrid, the Caixa Forum by Herzog and de Moron, which was once a brick power station, was converted into a museum in 2008. This project, and this is the photo montage created by the architects, contains two brutal examples of subtraction. The first was the extraordinary act of removing the whole of the ground floor. You can see the works to the building. And you can see where the ground floor was completely removed from the building. The second destructive act was to demolish any extraneous structures immediately in front of the museum to create a new public space. So there's two acts here. The first, obviously, is incredibly dramatic, to remove the ground floor, but the second was to create the space. And that, again, looks like nothing much is being done. We take this public space for granted, but by removing that, we can stand back and we can see the impact of the whole building. The removal of the base of the building allows this new plaza to flow into the museum, and thus creating spaces that are neither inside nor outside. They are under the building, but they are not enclosed by it. Let's see, this is a view from under the building, under this massive cantilever of the hovering extreme weight of them. The building appears to defy gravity. It is full of wonder, ambiguity and whimsy. And the architects have, through the visual removal of the intrinsic elements necessary for the structural stability of the building and the raising of the surrounding buildings, commented upon the congested nature of the environment. The limited heaviness of the industrial society that created the buildings, and the importance of the cultural industry to the 21st century societies. And you can see this is the rear of the building. And also the architects removed, blocked in a number of the windows and cut their own new windows in there. This is a policy, and we'll see it later on, they use quite a lot within their architecture. So the spaces inside are dictating the positions of the windows. So they're taking away to give views again through the building. And we can see the section through. It's incredibly interesting. The one on the left, you can see actually all of that is floating, and you can appreciate the amount of structural steelwork going into that. And the section on the right, the plaza at the front there, and the amount of structural steel going into support the weight of this huge cantilever. Not only is it visually heavy, it's incredibly physically heavy, and the rear of the building as well. And this is the back, and you can see it's just the floating quality isn't as extreme here, but you can see how the windows have been blocked in, new openings made, and the appearance with this structure on the top, the sheer mass of it, and again from the front, the plaza and the quality of the this building, the weight of it, it does defy gravity, it just hovers there. And this is another building, again by Herzog and de Meuron some years earlier. But I just wanted to show you, since this photograph was taken, they've designed a huge extension which sits on the top here. It's an enormous great structure, sort of bigger than the building itself, and very much using the same ideas that were in this building. But what's very, very interesting about this is, again, cutting holes, taking things away. It seems sort of quite minor to remove, block in. So the first thing they did was block in all of these holes, or all of these windows, using reclaimed bricks, and then cut new windows in the facade. And these new windows reflect the new use inside. Oh, I'm sorry about this pixelation, but this is one of their models, and this is a view of the gallery looking through one of these new slot windows. So these new cuts and holes and fissures in the building created to facilitate the new use. And the Bull Staircase in Prague. Now, this is an incredibly political act that happened after the First World War, when Czechoslovakia, which has now become Czech Republic and Slovakia, but Czechoslovakia became a republic. Above Prague, which is the capital city, was the castle. And we can see it here on the left, sitting way above the hill, on the hill above the town, and here is the town below. And the relationship between the two was such, very much the hierarchy of the ruling kings and queens, the royalty, and the people below. And they were very much protected by a strong wall around them. And when it became a republic, Plečnik was asked to make the castle itself became the seat of government, and he was asked to make it more democratic. So what he did was cut a hole in it. It's a simple thing, but rather than the people who live in the town or in the city having to walk all the way around the castle and enter it from the other side, they could walk straight up from the city into the castle, or to the palace, or what was now the seat of government. There were a number of other interventions that Plečnik made, other entranceways, and he did a lot of work on the public space. But this is the most significant, and also one of the most beautiful of all interventions. And you can see how at the top, it's almost sort of samperish, with this cloak of copper resting on these Minoan bulls, which is where it gets its name from, the Bull Staircase. And it's a language that isn't classical. It's not harking back to Greek and Roman times. That was quite important, but it has a sort of an authority to it. And this is the outside of it, looking down over the town itself. And this is a view through it. So this connection, which wasn't there before, made the palace accessible, the seat of government accessible to everybody in the town. And there's a view through it, and we can see the town beyond. And of course the bulls, the Minoan bulls, mythical figures really, where it gets its name from. And again, so what's interesting is that this, from the palace, it's situated in the corner behind the St. Vitus Cathedral, but from the town it's right in the middle. And it is a statement of intent, a political statement. This is another project that exploits and accentuates the quality of an existing building to the advantage of a new use. And this is the old slaughterhouse in Landau. And it was once a celebrated structure. You can see the old buildings there. Now, slaughterhouses, which today are situated on the outskirts of town, on the periphery, on the edge, were once right in the middle of any city or any urban location, because once meat was killed, it had to be distributed to those who were going to buy it very, very quickly, because until only a century ago, there weren't adequate refrigeration techniques. So slaughterhouses were situated in the centre of cities, and there are a number of great conversions of slaughterhouses or abattoirs. There's a fabulous one in Prague as well, and of course the School of Architecture in Rome is in a converted slaughterhouse. But this one has been converted into a library, and we can see the structure that went around it. And it was originally a celebrated structure, but it's no longer used, and Lamotte Architecture surrounded the abattoir with a new steel, glass and timbered louvered skin, thus relegating the original stone walls to internal partitions. And then, as you can see, and then there's the internal walls there. This is this new structure which is sliding through from, we're in the new, we're in the new part of the building at the moment, looking into the old part of the building. And then the original stone walls, these were then quite brutally carved into, almost butchered. The cuts and incisions facilitated movement through the library while making an illusory reference to its previous functions. These cuts and fissures echoed the function of the original building. An abattoir is something that the majority of the population doesn't really want to engage with, and it's a place that is acknowledged as necessary, but nowadays hidden. Meat is something that's almost divorced from its original source. However, this was very provocative of the architects to make a reference to the original purpose. The first, of course, is stripping out and carving the original building. And if I can go to one of the images that's not pixelated, this uncompromising horizontal louvers of this protective enclosure, almost reflective of the pens and the stalls that contained and controlled the animals prior to the slaughter. Indeed, the stonework walls of the original building do seem to peer forlornly over the top of this cage. And as we can see them there, a remembrance of the slaughterhouse is literally carved into the structure of the building. Perhaps the new function is entirely appropriate. A building in an industrial society provided food for the body. In a post-industrial society, it distributes cultural fodder. Another project that uses quite uncompromising act is the Extraordinary Centre for the Documentation of the Third Reich in Nuremberg. And when it was constructed, it was one of the most significant structures in Nazi Germany, but after the end of the Second World War, it lay dormant for years, and no one quite knew what to do with it. But equally, its massive social significance meant that it couldn't be demolished. So by virtue of its position within the German psyche as a city of great tradition, Nuremberg was, in 1933, officially designated as the City of Congress. And the great Nazi architect Albert Speer laid out the town itself, while Ludwig Ruff and his son Franz designed the horseshoe-shaped building. It was always problems. The ground was very unstable, very water. You can see it's right next to the water, and there was a lot of damp. There was a lot of flooding, so it always suffered from subsidence. And the weight of the granite cladding meant that it was all very liable to sinking, and it was actually never finished. And Gunther Dominik, it was converted into a centre for the documentation of the Third Reich, and it was only the square building is so huge. It was just this square building at the front that was used, or orthogonal building, I should say. And Dominik made a direct statement of intent which symbolised the new use. He inserted a dynamic diagonal cut directly against the grain of the original classical orthogonal building. This 21st century shard slices through. It begins as an entrance at the most northerly corner, and we can see here, an entrance here. And brutally and uncompromisingly cuts through the rooms and the courtyard and emerges into the massive open space at the centre of the horseshoe building. This blade-like element lacerates the space to create a central circulation route through the building. It's not a subtle statement. As this was not the time nor the place for sensitive reappraisals or careful installations. The form of the new building directly counterpoints the old. So the examples that we've been looking at so far have been very sympathetic in a way. They've worked with the qualities of the existing building and tried to expose them. This is a project working in exactly the opposite way. It's a bold proclamation on the history of the building and the relationship with the new function. It's not sensitive, and it's not subtle, and deliberately so. And we can see how it runs diagonally through the orthogonal structure. It's 130 metres long, this corridor, and rises through the space and shoots out to the back. And you can see the way it's cut the building, and these are almost reminiscent of the Matta Clark, the artist that we were talking at the beginning of the lecture about, who just cut through the building and left the edges raw. And it's deliberate that the edges of this space have been left raw, have been left uncleaned. There isn't the sense of making it beautiful and nice. It's deliberately left very, very raw. And again, this is a statement about the Germans' memories of the Third Reich and the importance not only to remember it so that it never happens again, but also is in a sense of an apology for what has happened. And it's a nice quote from Dominic: "I used oblique signs against the existing symmetry and ideological significance, and to contrast the heaviness of the concrete, brick and granite, I turned to lighter materials, glass, steel and aluminium. And the historic walls are left in their original state without being touched by the new work." Another decisive act of subtraction is also in Germany, but it's much, much more recent. It was only about 10 years ago. By Meixner, Schuster and Wendt architects. And this is a church which, when it was constructed, there was sort of about 12,000 people in the neighbourhood, and that neighbourhood has drastically reduced and the congregation size changed. So it became a building that was just much too big for its population. So the approach the architects took, but it was also significant. This tower is an incredibly flat area, and therefore any tower is a landmark. Now, originally the priests or the vicars wanted to knock the building down, but the architect said no. There's actually it's an important landmark within the collective memory of the area. So it would be better to remove some of it and make it smaller. So you can see how this red box, they took that away. And this is from their website. And you can see there's the original building. It was just moved. But what was at this end of the original building was the altar. And although the orientation of the building had changed, so the new altar was here, the memory of this was quite important to retain. So there's that sense of removing things, but actually retaining some of the qualities of it and the remembrance or memory of it. And you can see that in how these, the relief modelled within this end wall. So you can see this is the bit which is being removed. And again, we've got the tower. And the memory of what was there is inscribed on the wall itself. We can see here the original altar, and it's all just been pushed in, crushed in to this. It's something that visually symbolised what had been removed and reflected the separated, unneeded element. And thus, the building was cut down to an appropriate size. Oh, we can see how it is reused. This is the old altar. Other photographs have it looking at this original window, but the sense of cutting it down to size using decorative and structural work. And what's really nice as well is that this is the old nave of the church. And as a sort of pattern on the ground, again, is the memory of the pews. So you can see how they were once laid out. It's now become a playground, children's playground, or somewhere for people to meet. But the memory, almost like a basketball court, but has been laid out within the materials of the, and we can see people playing in it, materials of the ground itself. So it's an act of subtraction, but it's also an act of memory. And that importance of something like this within the collective memory of the community has been retained. And the last example I'm going to show you today is the Castle Vecchio Museum in Verona. And I think it's a much more gentle piece of architecture, but the architect was still uncompromisingly dogmatic in his realisation of his vision for the site, for the project. Elements that had a direct connection with the site were retained, while the redesign of the building also involved the careful process of subtracting elements of it. The remodelling goes far beyond what was originally expected from the project, and the narrative of the building has been unpicked and exposed. Therefore, huge areas of the building were torn away to reveal underlying layers of meaning and a careful collection of interventions which were used to accentuate the character of the castle. Now, Carlo Scarpa is recognised as the master of rebuilding and reuse and adaptation, and he's noted for his profound understanding of the relevance of landscape and materiality within design, as well as his grasp of native Venetian culture. He worked within the modernist tradition, and it was with great skill that he was able to employ modernist concepts of architectural promenade and transparency within the adaptation of classical buildings. And the Castle Vecchio is generally considered to be his greatest work, and by many as possibly the best example of building reuse ever constructed. So the approach that Scarpa took, and this is the plan, was to create historical clarity within the building itself. He carefully identified the various historical strata within the complex of structures, so they were all recognisable through the orderly uncovering of various fragments. And we can see a tower here, the original castle keep here, the relationship with the river, which was never there before, and the series of rooms in here, and the entrance is number 14 here into this space. And this is one of Scarpa's drawings, and this Can Grande statue is a symbol of Verona, where the building is. And so Scarpa was once situated in the front of the building here, and he moved it to a pivotal point just here. So a couple of things we can talk about. The first is that sense of slightly disconnecting the facade. So what's happening is, can I go back to that one? It's slightly better image. This is a facade, was a false facade that was put on in about 1923. And what Scarpa did was visually slightly disconnect it from the buildings. And you can see that by this false wall that he puts behind that, behind here and behind these windows. And because he was a modernist architect, there's a sense of movement to this. So the new windows don't quite line up with the windows in the original building. And therefore you get the impression that one is slipping behind the two, which is that sense of architectural promenade was one of the most important things about modernist architecture. And you see that in the work of people like Ludwig or Mies van der Rohe, I should say, and the Barcelona Pavilion, where the space is never static, as opposed to classical architecture, where the space is always static. So there's a sense of movement within here, which is incredibly important. And you can see that the way these window frames don't quite line up. And again, that's accentuated here with this new space behind. So the front facade and behind that facade seem slightly disconnected. That sense of disconnection is accentuated with the entrance itself, which instead of being a straight door is a screen which seems to welcome you into the building. And this disconnection between the building and the bridge or these walls. And you see the way he's scraped away, taken away all of these elements. But this sense of disconnection is accentuated by the roof. So we're getting the roof tiles and then a structure underneath the walls, underneath the roof, which slides through again. So this sense of movement, which is so important in his architecture, you see again and again. And this, as a sculpture, you see again and again. You see it when you enter, you see it as you wander through the building. And here it is. But interestingly, what's significant, although this statue was once sitting outside the castle, and Scarpa's moved it into the castle, he's not looking at you. And it's only later that you actually start to see him. And as you journey through the Castel Vecchio, and you get to here, is the only time you look him in the eyes. And again, that careful positioning. But here we get the idea of the interior sliding out of the original building. And again, the idea of space. Through scraping away and removing bits, so that Scarpa always feels that the building is slightly in motion. See the way the floor itself, there are lines across it running horizontally, so it's almost like water lapping through. But also this moat he has. The floors are slightly disconnected from the walls, they're moved away slightly, and again, which helps this feeling of floating. And then all of the artifacts are lifted from the ground. So we can see this one on the left. We don't see what it's sitting on. And even if we do see what they're sitting on, they're quite minor. And this one, the plinth that it's on, is quite small. So again and again, there's this feeling of movement and floating that comes through this. This sculpture is floating here, and we can see the moat. That's disconnection. So that idea of taking things away, removing things, it's not as bold a statement as the Centre for the Third Reich, or it's not as dramatic as the church in Dornbusch, where they removed a whole section of the building. But these small scrapes continually refine that sense of the building and the sense of movement in there. And we can see again here how these things are floating through and the way the light comes in. And what's very nice about this image as well is a doorway, which instead of being a regular square doorway, almost becomes human shaped. There's some steps up to it, and we're moving up into the next space, but it's been cut away almost like shoulders. So again, what that does is reduce the scale of the space. So we're moving from a grand gallery into a much smaller, more intimate space that's almost sort of domestic scale, and therefore slows our movement down into there, and that sense of the intimacy with which we need to look at these works of art rather than stand back. So the building doesn't look as if it's undergone a destructive or violent act. It has a warm and gentle honesty that hides the contravention of normal conservation practices. Subtraction is an intrinsic element within the art of architecture and remodelling. It's a strategy that can be both productive and shocking. It's a process that scrapes away at the building, which can be actually physically reveal the layers of meaning within the place and liberate new architecture. It can be violent and destructive, and it sometimes could even be described as vandalism. The Spanish architectural historian Inés de Sola Morales outlined a theoretical framework for understanding adapting buildings and remodelling them. And in his groundbreaking article From Contrast to Analogy, he described the development of remodelling as a concept that is closely related to the understanding of history. It's an enormous mistake to think that one could lay down a permanent doctrine that is, or still less a scientific definition of architectural intervention. On the contrary, it's only by understanding in each case the conceptions of the basis of which actions has been taken that it's possible to make out the different characteristics which this relationship has assumed over the course of time. But the violent act of subtraction is often overlooked in this process, and architects and designers who engage in the process of production, that is the act of adding to what's already there, often dismiss destruction, the modest process of destruction, because the ego of the architect is not satisfied. They're not producing anything, rather they're engaging in the process of expurgation or restriction. This little discussion has shown that the act of taking away is not something that is completely lost. The use of subtraction as a primary method of remodelling building can produce results that are full of surprise and wonder and delight, as well as a deep understanding of the symbolic judgment. It's an act that is usually a necessary stage in the process of architectural design, but for some projects it can be the most important, the most significant, central and vital method of communicating the character of the building. And as Snazzy says, every intervention results in some destruction. Destroy then, at least with understanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Salistan. This has been so inspiring. I'm sure it has been wonderful for all the attendees as well. I believe we are near the end of our time frame, but if it's okay for you as well, I will try to read some of the questions we have.
Yes, I'm sorry about the late start, and then the pixelation is because I transferred it on a stick very quickly from one machine to another, and we lost. But so I hope that it went all right. You could understand it. I think most of the pictures were all right, but slightly frustrating. We were saying how good Zoom was and how great it is for connecting, but all of a sudden it was, yeah. Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you, and the images were really great. It was in high quality, so there wasn't any pixelation. It was really good. And
good. There wasn't my end, so I don't. I don't know why, but anyway, brilliant, good, great stuff.
So the first question is, in terms of interventions into historic structures, how do you see star architects' role in the process of transformations? Is it more like they are imposing their own style, or that they are showing additions of new contemporary lives?
Well, that is such a good question. And I think what's quite interesting about this, in the UK, they have a prize called the Sterling Prize, and it's given for the best building by a British architect or on British land. So quite often this building may be in a different country, but as long as the architect or designer is registered in the UK. And up until about 8 years ago, it was always sort of flamboyant buildings. That Zaha Hadid won it a couple of times, Norman Foster with great big structures, great big energy consuming things. But over the last 8 years, that has changed. And 5 of the last 8 have been building reuse projects, which is brilliant. You know, it's what's happened is building reuse has moved from the periphery into the centre ground. So architects who wouldn't normally have gone anywhere near reuse are now actively involved in these sorts of projects, which has got to be great because it's such a sustainable approach to the development of the built environment. And I think it's double. There are 2 factors to it. There is that sense of always working with whoever's there as well. Whatever is there. So the quality of the building and that environment has to be understood. But also there's another layer of meaning, which is the agenda of the architect, which is, as you know, as an educator or as a student, you can send, I noticed there's 74 people here, you could give 74 students the same project to do and you get 74 different solutions. And that is what's so good about design. But they would, all of them, study the existing building, they'd study the needs of the new users, but it's always an act of interpretation. So it's 2 things. It is the qualities of what's there, and that is so very, very important, but there's also this sort of the agenda of the designer as well, which is great, because we're all different people, we all bring different things to it, and that's what's why it's such an interesting subject.
And just one question also. Cyprus.
Yeah.
Well known with the Cyprus problem and the division that comes with it, and its contested nature. How do you see interventions to historic heritage in this contest?
Oh, that is another very, very good question. And this sort of I'm running a project at the moment called Contested Heritage, and looking at buildings from buildings that are connected with the slave trade, buildings that are connected with other practices, and you know, you also have a lot of buildings that are contested, and it's not good enough just to knock that building down. It has to be, there has to be a sense of remembering that the collective memory of any population is really, really important, because we learn a building in a way is a monument, and a monument is testament to something that's happened, and we have to learn from the past. We can't afford to make mistakes again, but we can in a way come to terms with that. And that's what's sort of quite interesting about the building that I showed you, the documentation centre to the Third Reich, and the way the architect had smashed through it diagonally. So the orthodoxy of the classical building had been smashed with a diagonal stripe, a diagonal shard. And in a way it was saying, we defy what happened before. We don't, we're not trying to say it didn't happen, but it's very, very important that it doesn't happen again. So there are ways of coming to terms with that past, with that sinister heritage or the contested nature of something. So it can be part of the remodelling. It's part of the narrative. It's part of the story that building has to show or has to say. So yeah, good question, and very, very important that we don't forget. And that's one of the beauties about building reuse, is we don't forget.
Just one last question from. Okay. Last question. Would you please comment on the balance between subtractions made and adaptations in terms of reversibility concept within conservation?
Another good question. I think what's quite interesting about conservation is that quite often the conservator will pick a moment in time and they will take the building back to that moment, but that's never a real moment in time, because well, first of all, the pattern of time you can sometimes lose, but also the sense that a building might have been added to and changed over many years. So how do you take it back to a moment in time that maybe didn't exist anyway? So there is a sense that there's always some act of interpretation, and the architect or the designer has to make a decision about that. So, for instance, Scarpa in the Castel Vecchio, he did choose to remove a lot of the building, but the majority of it was still retained. And true passionate conservationists might say, no, that's wrong, we have to retain it all. But we can't live in a scarified past. We can't live in an environment of previous eras. We have to make our buildings fit for the 21st century, and our requirements are very different to those of previous centuries. Not only digital requirements, we're bigger people, and also our position in society has changed quite a lot. So, for instance, women who were once, to a certain extent, were servants within the home, they're now breadwinners. Now they're earning money, and kitchens are no longer sort of at the back of the building, but become to the centre of the house, where everybody can join in. So there's sort of certain massive changes that have already starting to take place to accommodate our society, and we have to embrace those. We can't just live in a past. And I'm not saying all buildings, that should happen to all buildings, because the some are incredibly important, and therefore they do need to be conserved in their original conditions. But the majority need to be updated to make them fit for a 21st century population. So yes, there is a balance to be struck, but equally, if they're not fit for the 21st century, they just become museums. And some museums are important, but not all of the time. We need to be able to live, and accommodate that. Otherwise, we'll keep on horizontal developments. We'll keep on building more and more buildings, and we need to densify. We need to become more efficient, and we need to use what we've already got. And it's sort of a sustainable approach. There's sort of embodied carbon already in these existing buildings. It's a crime to knock them down and start again. We have to be able to use that.
I believe we are at the end of our time frame. It has been a pleasure to listen to you, and thank you to everyone for their questions and their participation. I hope it has been a pleasure for you as well, dear Sally Stone. And we hope to see you in here, Cyprus, soon. And I believe this is the end of our lecture.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it has been a pleasure, and it is great to see inside your school and not understand. I can see the questions and I can't understand any of them. There's a couple of numbers, and I can read those, but it's great. I hope people can understand what I've had to say, and yeah, it'd be great when this is all over to come and talk again. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you, Hashir, for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was such an inspirational talk, Sally. Thank you.